We are going to start things off today talking about the empirical model of American politics. Hopefully you've had a good chance to review the lecture notes on that topic. That'll be super helpful as we work through these slides. That provides the skeleton. Here's where I try to fill in some of that and give the flesh of that, if you will, added onto that skeleton. So the empirical model, a model that's designed to help us better understand what goes on in American politics. Here we're looking at three sets of factors: structural, political, and governmental. Now when we're looking at this model, this pyramid that I've used to organize these three sets of factors, you'll see that at the base of the pyramid are the structural factors. Those are the most critical in some ways, the biggest factors, although often hard to pin down exactly the impact that they have on our politics. Structural factors, really big things like our demographic makeup, our racial, ethnic, religious makeup, things like that. Rules of the game, the Constitution, right, lays out the rules of the political game here in America. Big structural factors like that, including American history. So those are the structural factors that we'll be talking about throughout the semester to better understand what goes on in American politics. The next slice up on that pyramid from the bottom would be political factors. These are things like the role of political parties, the role of interest groups, the role of the media, social movements, things like that. We'll go into much more detail about each of these sets of factors in just a bit, by the way. And then finally, at the very top of the pyramid, the things that we're going to most be able to see in our politics, the behavior of Congress, the role of the American president, the role of the federal courts, state governments, things like that, right? The quintessential classic governmental actors that we think about when we think about American politics. So the structural factors, I've described them as the tectonic plates of our politics, right? Deep under the Earth's crust. But when those things move, they cause a lot of changes and dynamics with things on the surface, i.e. the political and governmental factors that we just noted here. Now, to help you better understand this empirical model, it often helps to show you how it works in practice and to show you that it does work in practice, that this is not just abstract theory, but it's theory that actually works, theory that helps us better understand what goes on in American politics. So that demonstration in this case is going to be, as we develop this model, we're going to apply it to a major event that takes place in 1964 and 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is a major change in American politics, what some have called a civil rights revolution. Others have called America's second Reconstruction. And I'll talk about why it's called that in subsequent slides. Now we're going to spend the rest of this slideshow talking about the base of that empirical model pyramid. We're going to be talking here about structural factors. So as I noted before, the structural factors that we'll be talking about, one by one: political culture. That's an important structural factor. What do we believe as a people about our politics? Hopefully, for example, we believe in the democratic ethos. We'll go into detail very shortly on that. That's a good example of a structural factor. Things that we believe as a people. Things like the value of democracy. The rules of the game, another great example of a structural factor. Right? The U.S. Constitution gives Congress a certain amount of power. They give the president a certain amount of power. They give the federal courts a certain amount of power. The states have a certain amount of power. We, the people, have a certain amount of power. We have this thing called the Bill of Rights that guarantees certain fundamental rights and liberties to we, the people, so on and so forth. An important structural factor. Another one, demographics. Our racial, ethnic, and religious makeup, for example, that has a significant impact on our politics. Go into detail momentarily. History, super important structural factor that shapes our politics. And then finally, America's place in the international order, right? Ever since World War II, the U.S. has been a global superpower. we'll see that that massive fact has a big impact on what goes on in our politics. American history as a key structural factor that shapes our politics today? Absolutely. The argument here in the context of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, right, we would say that the only way to understand that legislation is to understand that the U.S. was born at the beginning in original sin, born with the institution of slavery. Jefferson writes the Declaration, claims that all men are created equal, but he also possessed north of 200 slaves. And he said later on, as he reflected upon these things, when I reflect that God is just, I tremble for America. His recognition that there's going to be hell to pay at some point for the United States for the institution of slavery, and of course he was absolutely correct. This eventuates in the Civil War. And we know that not only did we have this institution from the beginning, but it was built directly into the U.S. Constitution. The 3/5 compromise that most people are aware of, we'll come back to that later. Also, however, a fugitive slave clause built into the Constitution, i.e., if a slave were to escape a southern state and reach freedom in a northern state, constitutionally, the northern state is obligated to return that slave to the rightful owner in the South. So there was that as well. And then finally, there was the other provision that we could abolish the institution of, not the institution, we could abolish the importation of slaves after about 1806 or something like that. That sounds like kind of a good deal, right, for the North? But by then there were plenty of slaves already in the United States. If anything, by restricting imports, kind of what Trump wants to do now, right, in a lot of ways, restrict imports. The issue there, though, then becomes that the value of that property becomes much greater under the conditions of no more importation. So you're limiting supply, demand remains at least constant, drives the price up. So for Southerners, in some ways, that was actually a pretty good deal, right? Yeah, we can no longer import slaves, perhaps after about 1806, but that increases the value of our property. So the South, they just win and win and win some more on the issue of slavery. They demand that it be included in the Constitution, and it is included in the Constitution. We'll look at that more closely a little bit later on, but it's built in using very neutral kind of legalese that hides the brutality of the institution. Okay, and so we know then, right, that creates the conditions for what ultimately becomes the Civil War, the attempt to abolish slavery. The 13th Amendment does abolish it, although it creates the exception of unless we're talking about a prison situation, and some would say that's the new Jim Crow today is the disproportionate incarceration of African Americans. So they do create that exception in the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, right? No state shall deny to any citizen equal protection of the law. And then the 15th Amendment, states were not allowed to deny voting rights to the newly freed male slaves. Women, of course, those rights are not addressed nationally until much later. So that was Reconstruction, right? The effort by the North to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the American South. Federal troops are sent down there to make that happen. And for about a dozen years, that's a relatively successful process. You begin to see the flowering of African-American political power, African-Americans elected for the first time to the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives. African-American families begin to come back together. They begin to get more engaged in the economy. So a lot of hopeful signs here that we were atoning for our original sin. But of course, by 1876, in a complicated political deal between the two major parties, Reconstruction is ended. Federal troops are pulled out of the South. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are no longer effectively being enforced. And it's game on for the White South. This is where you see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. the rise of Jim Crow, the rise of intense racial segregation, and the denial of voting rights, and all of that. So that's our first reconstruction, right? To atone for this original sin of slavery. It is a failure. And then we do decide, right, by the 1960s that it is time, probably past time, to finally address this issue. And so, right, our history creates the conditions that give rise to this civil rights reformation in 64 and 65. The Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. So if you know something about our history, right, then this moment in time, this political upheaval, this civil rights earthquake becomes a lot more meaningful. We can understand it a lot better, right? That you can make a lot more sense out of that legislation if you know something about the history of the United States. And in fact, if you don't know that history, that legislation seems rather odd altogether. But once you take into account history, you realize, oh yeah, this is why there was a need to address this. So my argument then, right, that American history, an important structural factor that shapes our politics, and we can see how that can be indeed an effective sort of a model, because when you apply it to the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, it gives us a much better handle on the meaning of what happened at that moment in American political history. All right, let's take our first structural factor, American political culture. Again, these are things that we believe as a people. Does that indeed help explain what happens in our politics? I believe that it does. If we're using the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 as the thing that we're trying to explain, certainly you can make a strong case that certain fundamental American beliefs, such as what we see in the Declaration of Independence, right? The idea that all men are created equal, that we are endowed by a Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the equal protection of the law. All of these things, right, put pressure on our politics to produce civil rights reform, because we had been born in original sin. We'll talk about that momentarily. Born in original sin with slavery at the beginning. We do come to grips with it a little bit with the Civil War, but then that falls apart with the collapse of Reconstruction by 1877. And that leaves us, right, with a huge civil rights problem, certainly in the entire country, but more specifically and most emphatically in the South. Jim Crowism. Unequal treatment, segregation, and so on. So we know then that the impetus to finally come to grips with that, it finally hits in 1964 and 1965, partly because of the deep pressure created by what we believe as a people. Because if we believe that all men are created equal, if we really believe that, you're going to have to deal with this civil rights issue in the American South. If we believe that we are endowed by our Creator, all of us, with certain unalienable rights, you've got to come to grips with this civil rights issue. The denial of civil rights to people of color across the American South. Not just in the American South, but most extremely in the American South. If we genuinely believe in the equal protection of the law, right, that no state shall deny any citizen equal protection of the law, again, you can see that civil rights reformation springs out of that belief in equal protection of the law. We have been denying it for so long, in the South in particular. So hopefully you can see then that indeed, if you better understand American political culture, that's going to give you a good handle on why things happen in our politics that do happen. Oftentimes it's going to be because of some of the pressure created by some of the things that we believe as a people. Yet another important structural factor in American politics, the U.S. Constitution, part of the rules of the game, right, in terms of a rule book for American politics. A lot of those rules, not all of them, but a lot of them, can be found in the U.S. Constitution, as amended over time. So we know then, right, that in terms of the rules of the game, we now have, contra what we had under the Articles of Confederation early days, we'll talk about that in a little bit, we now have a United States of America in which the national government is is stronger than the state governments. States have real power, and that's laid out vaguely in the 10th Amendment. But ultimately, right, the Constitution also contains something called the Supremacy Clause. When there's a conflict between national and state governments, national government will prevail, as long as the national government is exercising its enumerated powers. That's an important caveat. So we know then that under the terms of the U.S. Constitution, if the national government wants to get something done and the states resist, the states will have to submit, generally speaking. This is crucial, right? Because without something like the Supremacy Clause, this whole civil rights reformation doesn't really work. But Congress decides finally to exert their power vis-a-vis civil rights, and they make it very clear, look, state governments in the South, private businesses in the South, citizens in the South, you can no longer do what you've been doing for so long, which is sticking it to African Americans. You've got to behave right. You have to provide equal protection of the law. You have to provide for basic civil rights for people of color. You can no longer deny voting rights to people of color. And Congress has that power, right? Because we know that they're given a great deal of power under the terms of the U.S. Constitution as part of the national government. So, are the rules of the game? In this case, the U.S. Constitution, an important structural factor that helps us better understand what goes on in politics. Good Lord, yes. And you can see that when it's applied to America's second Reconstruction. An additional structural factor that we can use to better understand what goes on in American politics, demographics. Okay, demographics. There's a wide range of demographic factors that we'll consider a little later on in the course. For today, we're just going to focus on how we can use this in a particular way to understand a particular thing, the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65. So what is happening in America demographically that helps make this happen? Very briefly put, the Great Migration. Check out that YouTube video if you have the time. It's about 14 or 15 minutes. So this Great Migration is the mass movement of millions of African Americans over time from about 1910 to about 1970 out of the rural, agricultural South and into the industrial, urbanized North. Millions, I think roughly 5-6 million, something like that. It's a mass migration. Why is this politically significant for our purposes? Because then these millions of African Americans go from being unable to vote in the South to being able to vote in the North, right? Because they're moving to cities like Cleveland, Ohio, Chicago, Illinois, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New York City, New York, Detroit, Michigan, and Baltimore, Maryland, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on and on, right? So now they're able to vote. Plus, once they move to the North, well, their economic futures get a whole lot brighter because there's a lot of industrial jobs. This is the great age of industrial production in America. That doesn't require a lot of education, pays a decent wage, are often unionized, right? So again, that makes African Americans much more of a potent political force. And so this mass migration, this demographic shift in America, right, goes a heck of a long way towards understanding why we do get civil rights legislation. Because once we have African Americans who are more economically empowered, more politically empowered in key states in the North, that puts pressure on members of Congress that represent states like Illinois, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, Illinois, Maryland. You get the idea, right? There's now a lot of pressure on members of Congress from those northern states to support and advance a civil rights agenda, which they ultimately do in 1964 and 1965. All right. Another important structural factor that we can use to better understand what goes on in American politics, in this case, the shape of the international order, global politics, and in our case, of course, America's place in global politics. What's our position in global politics circa the mid-1960s? We are a global superpower, right? Because we become that global superpower post-World War II. Britain is decimated after World War II. France is decimated. Japan is decimated. Much of the world is pretty decimated. America is largely untouched. So we emerge as an absolute global superpower, both militarily and economically, and increasingly culturally, opposed really only at the time by the Soviet Union, the USSR. And so what emerges from the end of World War II is this sort of global battle between, on the one hand, the United States, and on the other, the Soviet Union, the so-called Cold War. No direct hot war between those two powers, thank God, because that would have been nuclear and incredibly devastating. But a lot of conflict between proxy wars in places like Korea and Vietnam and in South America. Now, Kennedy ultimately defeats Nixon in the 1960 election by arguing that there's a missile gap with the Soviet Union, and Kennedy is going to be the one who will close the missile gap with the Soviet Union, defeat the Soviet Union, win the Cold War, and become the world's only global superpower. So that's his thing, man. He is all about foreign policy, not that interested in domestic policy. However, right, this becomes important. How do we win that Cold War? Some of it might be through military means, but a lot of it has to be cultural, right? So-called soft power. What does soft power consist of? Things like the U.S. in this case being seen as desirable by non-aligned nations that are thinking, should we align ourselves with the Soviet Union or the United States? A lot of third world countries, often made up of a lot of people of color in places like Asia and Africa and South America. How do we win over those people to our side? By being seen as desirable, by being seen as genuinely democratic, genuinely freedom-loving, right? So if we can make that case and then argue that the Soviet Union is not all of that, we've got a much better chance of winning the Cold War. What's the problem then for the United States at this moment in time? Jim Crow in the South, right? The way African Americans in particular are being treated in the American South, being treated with brutality, lynchings, segregation, second-class, third-class citizenship, denial of voting rights, the whole 9 yards here, right? So it becomes important for Kennedy, not that he's necessarily all that interested in domestic politics or even that interested in a civil rights agenda, but if he believes that a civil rights agenda will help the U.S. win the Cold War, which is what he's really focused on, right, then it becomes incumbent on Kennedy to indeed help to advance a civil rights agenda. He was often sort of dragged kicking and screaming to that civil rights table, but he did ultimately arrive at that table. A little late, maybe $1 short, a day late sort of a thing. But he does ultimately come to the table and supports a version of what later becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So there you have it, right? Is America's place in the world an important way to think about what happens in our politics? Absolutely. And hopefully I've shown you that with this particular example. All right, let's pull it all together now. What have we been doing here with these slides? Looking at structural factors and how they shape American politics. Structural factors are an important part of the empirical model that we're building. It's the bottom part of that pyramid that we laid out several slides ago. Some of the structural factors that we've been looking at: American political culture, American history, demographics, the U.S. Constitution, America's place in the world, right? These are all structural factors that the better you can understand these factors, the better you can understand what goes on in American politics. That's what empirical models are all about, right? Understanding what happens. And I've tried to cement my case for this set of factors by showing how they can deepen our understanding of America's Second Reconstruction, Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65. All right, so with all of this out of the way, we're now going to move on in the next PowerPoint presentation on Canvas to look at some political factors that shape American politics, another part of our empirical model. Thanks.